The moment General Ashford called me sweetheart in front of 47 officers, I made a decision. I didn't flinch, I didn't blink. I just stood there in my dress blues and let the laughter wash over me like it was weather. He didn't know what I was. Not yet. My name is Sera Quinlan, and I've been told I have a face that doesn't match my record. That's not a compliment from the men who say it. What they mean is, you look like someone who should be filing papers, not flying Black Hawks into valleys that don't appear on any public map. What they mean is, we don't know how to feel about you being here, so we're going to make you feel small until you leave. I didn't leave. I joined the Army at 22, straight out of Clarkson University with an aerospace engineering degree and a stubborn streak my mother had been trying to sand down my entire life. She wanted me close to home. Binghamton, New York, third house from the corner, the one with the blue shutters she repainted every spring. My father wanted me to be practical. He was a union's electrician, a good man who worked with his hands and distrusted anything he couldn't fix himself. He didn't know what to do with a daughter who wanted to fly things that cost $12 million. You don't have to prove anything, he used to say. I used to think he was wrong about that. Fort Rucker changed me, not broke me, changed me. There's a difference, and it took me years to understand it. The instructors there had seen 100 women walk through those doors with something to prove, and they'd watched most of them either burn out or harden into something unrecognizable. I tried not to do either. I flew. I studied. I kept my mouth shut when the comments started, and my head down when the jokes got mean, and by the time I earned my wings, I had the third highest flight score in my class. The two men ahead of me never let me forget they were ahead of me. I requested assignment to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, and was told politely that my request had been noted. 6 months later, I was stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, flying support missions that mattered but didn't carry the weight I was looking for. I was good at my job. I knew I was good at my job. And I spent every day in a place where that goodness was treated like a rumor. My commanding officer at the time was Lieutenant Colonel Davenport. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved from military doctrine. Square jaw, immaculate posture, 30 years of service in every crease of his uniform. He was fair, mostly. He wasn't the problem. The problem was his executive officer. His name was Major Kress. And from the first week I arrived at Fort Campbell, he treated my presence like a scheduling error someone hadn't gotten around to correcting. I want to be clear about something. I had dealt with men like Major Kress before. I knew the type. They weren't always loud about it. Sometimes they were perfectly polite, almost friendly, and the hostility only showed up in the paperwork, in which missions you got assigned, in whose after-action reports were flagged for commendation and whose got filed without comment. Kress was that kind, smiling to my face, systematic in everything else. I didn't realize how systematic until the winter of my third year at Fort Campbell. We had a training exercise up at the National Training Center in California, and I was selected to lead a night navigation flight over a sector that had been giving the newer pilots trouble. It wasn't glamorous work, but I was good at it, and I was proud to be trusted with it. I spent 2 weeks preparing. I knew that terrain the way I knew the drive from my parents' house to the airport. Every ridge, every false horizons in, every place where the thermals did something unexpected in the dark. The night of the exercise, I was pulled from the flight roster. No explanation in the official record. Just a different name where mine had been. I found out through another pilot, a good man named Royce, who'd been flying with me long enough to know when something wasn't right, that Kress had personally requested the change. The reason given, unofficially, was that the exercise parameters had been updated and required a more experienced hand. I had more flight hours than the pilot who replaced me. I went to Lieutenant Colonel Davenport. I was calm. I used words like concerned and clarification and review process. He listened the way men listen when they've already decided not to act, with their eyes slightly above your head, nodding at a frequency that means nothing. He told me he would look into it. He didn't look into it. What he did was forward my concern to Cress, who called me into his office the following morning and told me with that same smile that I was showing a lack of unit cohesion by raising the issue at all. "You're a good pilot, Quinlan," he said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I nodded, I walked out, and I started keeping records. Not because I was bitter, or not only because of that. Because I had watched what happened to women who raised their voices without documentation. They became the story instead of the issue. I wasn't going to become the story. For the next 18 months, I kept a personal log. Every reassignment, every time a commendation I'd earned appeared in someone else's file, every mission I was quietly bumped from without cause. I kept it on an encrypted drive, updated it the same night each incident occurred, while the details were still precise in my mind, and I told no one about it except Royce, who read through it one evening in the break room and went very quiet for a long time. "Sera," he finally said, "this is a pattern. I know it's a pattern. You need to take this somewhere. I need more first." He didn't argue. He understood, I think, that I wasn't being cautious out of fear. I was being cautious because I intended to win. The thing about Cress that I didn't understand until much later, until after everything had already come apart, was that his campaign against me wasn't entirely personal. It was also professional, in the most corrupt sense of the word. He had been building a specific operational record for the last several years, a record that depended on a particular kind of narrative, that the pilots under his command who succeeded did so because of his leadership, and the ones who struggled did so despite his patience. I was too good to fit that narrative, and I know now, actually, that he was afraid of what my flight record said about his judgment in trying to marginalize me. But I didn't know the full shape of it until the night of the incident in Nevada. We were running a joint exercise with Air Force personnel out of Nellis. Complex, multi-platform, simulated search and rescue in a contested environment. I was flying lead bird on a 3-helicopter element. Cress was not on the flight. He was back at the forward operating area, which was where he usually was during anything that carried real risk. That should have been my first warning that something was off, because Cress was the kind of man who only stepped back when he'd already arranged for something to go wrong in a way that couldn't be traced to him. 40 minutes into the exercise, I got a redirect order over my headset. New coordinates, immediate, no explanation. The coordinates took my element away from the exercise area and into a corridor that hadn't been briefed. I queried it. The controller confirmed. So I flew the redirect because that's what you do. You don't argue with confirmed orders in the middle of a live exercise, not when you have 2 other crews depending on your decisions. The corridor turned out to be the problem. It wasn't on any of our cleared flight paths. In a real operation, taking that route without prior coordination would have created a serious navigation and deconfliction issue. In the after-action review, my element was flagged for the deviation. My name was at the top of the report. I submitted an immediate rebuttal with my radio logs showing the redirect order. The logs were reviewed. The review concluded that there had been a communication error and that the source of the redirect could not be definitively established. Cress, in the debrief, suggested that I had perhaps misinterpreted the order. I sat in that room and I looked at him and I thought, there it is. This is what you've been building toward. You needed something on paper and now you have it, even if it's buried in ambiguity. Royce found me outside afterward. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there in the cold Nevada air and then he said, "How long have you been keeping that log?" 19 months. Is the redirect order in there? It's in there with a timestamp from the moment I received it. He exhaled. Then it's not over. He was right. But it got worse before it got better. The report from the Nevada exercise went into my file with a notation I had to fight to have contextualized. My next evaluation cycle showed comments about judgment under pressure that were technically neutral and unmistakably pointed. I was passed over for a leadership position I had been informally told I was being considered for. The officer who got it had less time in grade and a flight record that, objectively, wasn't close to mine. I submitted a formal complaint, not informal this time, formal in writing, to the Inspector General's office. That was when things got quiet in a way that felt dangerous. Kress stopped smiling at me. He stopped acknowledging me in the hallway at all. The other officers in the unit, the ones who'd been casually friendly, the ones who came to my birthday card and asked about my family at the holiday party, they got careful. Not cold, exactly. Careful. Like they were waiting to see which way something was going to fall before they decided where to stand. I understood it. I didn't forgive it, but I understood it. No one wants to be collateral damage in someone else's fight. What I didn't expect was my mother. She called me on a Thursday night in March, and I could hear it in her voice before she said a word. That particular combination of worry and something approaching shame that I hadn't heard since I was 16 and had gotten into trouble for spray painting a protest slogan on the school gymnasium wall. She'd heard things from her sister, who'd heard from a neighbor's son who was in the army, who'd apparently heard some version of my situation filtered through however many degrees of military gossip. "People are saying you're causing problems," she said. "I filed a complaint about a senior officer who falsified my operational record. Sera. That's what happened." There was a long silence, and then she said quietly, "I just want you to come home safe." And I had to close my eyes and breathe for a moment because I knew she didn't mean physically. She meant she wanted me to stop making enemies. She meant she was afraid for me in the way mothers get afraid when they can see something coming from farther away than their daughters can. "I'll be fine," I told her. I wasn't sure I believed it. The IG investigation moved slowly, the way these things always do. Months passed. I kept flying. I kept my head down and my record clean and my log updated. Royce transferred to a unit at Fort Bragg, which hit harder than I expected, not because I needed him strategically, but because he was the only person in that building who looked at me like I was fully real. The day everything changed was a Tuesday in September, 14 months after I'd filed the formal complaint. I was in the hangar doing a pre-flight inspection when one of the younger warrant officers found me. His name was Kellum, and he'd only been in the unit for about 8 months. He was nervous in a way that had nothing to do with the aircraft. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. "Not here." We drove to a diner off post, a place with vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime the previous week. Kellum put his hands around his mug and stared at the table for a moment. "I was there," he said, "at Nellis. I was in the comms section. I went very still. The redirect order," he said. "I know where it came from." What Kellum told me over the next 45 minutes rearranged everything. I thought I understood about the last 2 years. The redirect order hadn't been a communication error. It had been generated from within the forward operating area, from Kress's position, using authentication codes that were supposed to belong to the exercise controller. Kellum had been a junior analyst in the comms section that night. He'd seen the transmission go out. He'd been told afterward by someone senior to him to forget what he'd seen. He'd been forgetting it for 14 months. And then, apparently, he'd decided he was done forgetting. "Why now?" I asked him. He looked at his coffee. "I'm getting out. 18 days left. I've got a job offer from an engineering firm in Charlotte, and I've been thinking about this for a year, and He shook his head. "I don't want to carry it with me." I drove back to post with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind running through every implication. What Kellum was describing was not a miscommunication. It was a deliberate act. It was the use of official military authentication systems to manufacture a black mark on my operational record. That wasn't a career dispute. That was a federal issue. I called a JAG attorney that same evening. The next 6 weeks were the longest of my life. The IG investigation, which had been moving at its own glacial pace, was suddenly activated by new evidence. Kellum gave a formal statement. The comms logs from the Nellis exercise, which had apparently been retained despite everything, were subpoenaed. A signals analysis unit determined that the authentication codes used for the redirect had been accessed from Kress's terminal. Kress retained a civilian attorney and said nothing publicly. His supporters in the unit, the ones who had been watching carefully to see which way things fell very fast in a very specific direction. Lieutenant Colonel Davenport requested a meeting with me. He sat across from me in his office, and for the first time in 3 years, he looked directly at me instead of at a point slightly above my head. "I owe you an apology," he said. I let that sit in the air for a moment. "Yes," I said. "You do." He gave it. It was formal and inadequate, and I accepted it anyway, because I was tired of carrying things. The Article 32 hearing took place in December. I sat in a hard chair in a conference room at Fort Campbell and watched the case laid out. The pattern of reassignments, the falsified redirect, the attempted suppression of Kellum's testimony by a third party who was separately under investigation. My 19 months of logs were submitted into evidence. The timestamp on every entry held. Kress was relieved of command pending the outcome. The final disposition came down 4 months later. He was found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer and of the unauthorized use of military communication systems. He lost his rank. He lost his pension. He was separated from the Army. I found out on a Wednesday morning, standing in my kitchen in Fort Campbell with a cup of coffee I hadn't drunk yet. Royce had called me from Fort Bragg. Someone had texted him, apparently, which was how news traveled in this world. "Quinlan," he said, "it's done." I sat down on the kitchen floor, not because my knees gave out, just because I needed to be somewhere low for a minute. The linoleum was cold through my PT uniform, and I sat there with the phone in my hand and I cried, not prettily, not quietly, in a way that would have embarrassed me if anyone had seen it. I cried like I'd been holding something underwater for 3 years and had finally been allowed to let it come up. Then I stood up, washed my face, and drove to work. The commendation came several months later, after the command review that followed the investigation had been completed. I stood in a formal ceremony that felt slightly unreal, the way things feel when you've imagined them for so long that the actual version seems like a copy of a copy. My mother was there. She'd driven down from Binghamton, which for her was an event requiring 2 weeks of preparation and a new blazer. She stood at the edge of the assembled personnel with her hands clasped in front of her. And I caught her eye at one point, and she gave me a look I'm not sure I can describe. Pride, but old pride, the kind that's been sitting in someone for years, waiting for permission to come out. My father was there too. He'd told me the night before, in the hotel room where we'd all gotten dinner, that he'd never really understood what I was trying to do. "I understand it now," he said. That was the whole sentence. That was all he had for me, and it was enough. The commendation noted, specifically, my sustained documentation of the pattern of misconduct and my contribution to the corrective action that followed. It used formal language that translated, roughly, into, "You were right, you were thorough," and the record shows it. General Ashford, the man who had called me sweetheart in that briefing room 3 years earlier, who had stood in front of 47 officers and laughed at something he'd decided about me in about 4 seconds, presented the commendation. I watched his face when he read my name. Not the name Quinlan that he'd been laughing at, the name in context, the name attached to the record that was now in front of him. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. I had the discipline not to smile. He shook my hand. His grip was firm, professional, the way it would have been for any officer in that room. "Well done, Captain," he said, and I looked at him straight on and said, "Thank you, sir." And that was that. No drama, no moment. Just the truth, which had been true the whole time, finally visible to everyone who'd been choosing not to see it. My mother cried. My father did not cry, but came very close, in the way men of his generation come close. The jaw tightening, the blink that happens a fraction too slowly. Royce texted me from Fort Bragg. How'd it feel? I thought about it for a minute before I wrote back. Like weather, I wrote, like something that was always coming. 6 months after the ceremony, I received notification that I'd been selected for the 160th SOAR, the Night Stalkers, the assignment I had requested and been quietly redirected away from years before. I read the notification twice, standing in the parking lot of a grocery store in Clarksville, Tennessee, with a bag of groceries in my other hand. Then I sat in my car for a minute. My mother called that evening, as if she had some kind of sonar for the moments when things happened to me. "How are you?" she asked. "I got the assignment," I said, "the one I wanted, the first one." She didn't say anything for a moment. I could hear the television in the background. She always had it on low, and the sound of something on the stove. "Good," she finally said. Just that. Good. I laughed. I couldn't help it. 3 years, 19 months of logs, a federal investigation, an Article 32 hearing, 4 months of waiting, and my mother's response from the third house from the corner with the blue shutters was, "Good." "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, it is." I've thought sometimes about what I would say to the version of myself who walked into that briefing room the day General Ashford called me sweetheart, the one who stood ramrod straight and let the laughter wash over her and made a quiet decision. I think I would tell her, "You were right to go quiet. You were right to start writing things down. You were right not to let them turn you into the story." I would also tell her it's going to be longer than you think, and harder in the ways you don't expect, not the official hostility which you are prepared for, but the small abandonments, the people who get careful, the conversations that stop when you walk into the room, the way your mother's voice sounds when she asks you to just come home safe. I would tell her to cry on the kitchen floor when it's over. Don't try to be composed about it. You've been composed for 3 years. Give yourself the floor. The Night Stalkers have a saying, "Night Stalkers don't quit." I didn't know it when I first put in that request. I know it now. I know it in the particular way you know things that have been proven against you, tested in conditions you didn't choose, verified by an outcome you had to fight 4 years for. I fly night missions now. Low, fast, in the dark, over terrain that doesn't appear on any public map. Nobody calls me sweetheart. They call me by my call sign. And every time I hear it, I think about a room full of laughter, and a decision I made, and a 19-month log on an encrypted drive, and my father's face going almost, but not quite, to tears in a ceremony at Fort Campbell. The record speaks for itself. It always did. It just needed someone stubborn enough to make sure it was heard.